Hey everyone, welcome back. My name is Alex. Welcome to the Orchard Family Podcast. So grateful that you've tuned in. Make sure to like and subscribe and to share this podcast with a friend as we are jumping into week 4 of our Disciplines series through Lent. This week we are talking about the need for Christian community. Hope you enjoy. All right, well, welcome back to the Orchard Family Podcast, Lent edition or season, I don't know, series, what we're calling this, kind of where we're going through the disciplines this week. We're joined, as always, by Wes and Jess. Hey, guys.
Hey, Alex.
Welcome back.
So glad to be here.
So we were talking about the discipline of community today, and I think this is an interesting, it's not quite like prayer, right? It's not quite like fasting or any of the things that we've talked about thus far as disciplines. We know community is important. Even at the Orchard, it's one of our core values. The primary context of discipleship happens in community. So when we think about that in Orchard language or for us as a church, what does that kind of mean when we say the primary context of discipleship is community? Thoughts?
So I think for the Orchard, we're not a traditional church to where we don't have Sunday school.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times when people come new, they're a little surprised by that we don't have that. And so it is a great place that we say a lot here is to make big church small, is to find a small group, a community group, to really just become ingrained and do life with that group. And so that is the best way to get to know people in our church and really to grow in their faith. We even love, like in a pastoral care instance, that a small group knows something even before we do.
Right.
That is their hands and feet of Jesus, and that's who they're reaching out to.
Yeah, I think fundamentally the Bible teaches us that connecting to God is something that we do in community. And as far as like growth, growing closer to Jesus, growing more and more in the image of God, whether you want to call that discipleship or spiritual formation or whatever, that these things can't be done alone. In Genesis 2:18, I believe that God says it's not good for man to be alone.
Right.
And of course, that's linked to marriage, but I think it's true. And when we think like even more fundamentally theologically about it, it's that God himself is a community. Mm-hmm. God he is what he is beyond our understanding as far as like his personality, his nature, I guess, as a triune God. But we have Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and we're talking about an eternal being who has like been in community and has created us in his image to be. So there's always something missing, I think. I'll stop now, but there's always something missing, I think, when we try to just do it by ourselves.
Yeah, I'm reminded of that. I don't even know who to attribute it to. No man is an island. Mm-hmm. That like we all have connections. We all have people that we are connected to, and a community of people that surround us. Whether we live by ourselves and work from home and do these things, like we still interact with people on a regular basis, and our faith shouldn't be no different. I think as it pulls us to look more like Christ. Christ surrounded himself with his disciples, with the people that he loved the most. Even in our Trinitarian God, as you talked about, even all throughout the scriptures, we see the need for a good community pulling us to Jesus. That's one of our texts I want to point us to today is in Mark chapter 2. If you want to read that, maybe just the first 5 verses, I think, of Mark chapter 2,
1 through 5.
Mm-hmm.
When Jesus returned to Capernaum several days later, the news spread quickly that he was back home. Soon the house where he was staying was so packed with visitors that there was no room even outside the door. While he was preaching God's word to them, 4 men arrived carrying a paralyzed man on a mat. They couldn't bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, so they dug a hole through the roof above his head. Then they lowered the man on his mat right down in front of Jesus. Seeing their faith, Jesus said to the paralyzed man, "My child, your sins are forgiven."
So this may seem like a unique text to talk about the purpose or the discipline of community, but I think that this picture of 4 friends who will stop at nothing to get their friend to Jesus is a really clear picture of what Christian community can be in our lives, right? That at our lowest moments or our hardest moments and our toughest times, that we have friends who will stop what they're doing, who will come over to our house, who will come sit with us, who will talk with us, who will take an extended lunch break or whatever it may be to care for us, to help us, and to ultimately pull us towards Jesus.
There's a guy named J.D. Walt who was the dean of the chapel at Asbury Seminary when I was there, and he would always whenever he would speak or when he'd do like the call to worship at chapel, he would always say something. I thought this guy's weird. Like, this is the weirdest thing I've ever heard anyone say. But he'd always say, "The Spirit of Christ in me greets the Spirit of Christ in you." And I'd be like, "What is he talking about?" Because I didn't know. But the reality is we all have the same Spirit of God living within our veins, and the church is the means through which God has chosen to minister, whether that's to each other with spiritual gifts. Like anytime there's spiritual gift talks in the Bible, whether it's Ephesians 4 or Romans or 1 Corinthians 12 through 14, it's always talking about how we build one another up. The gifts are not for ourselves; they're for others. And so, we again, we're not meant to do this faith alone. And people around me, God speaks to me through the people around me just as much and just as powerfully, if not more, than when I'm on my own.
It's those people around us, whether we know them from church or we know them from work. I mean, there's so many different secular examples of communities that we find ourselves. I don't know if you're a part of like an extra curricular thing, maybe, like part of a run club or a HOA or I don't know. Are you part of something outside of like a church that,
Unfortunately, I am part of an HOA. I would like to not be in that if that's possible.
Yeah, but even like the secular world, right, tries to create these community atmospheres. They try to create, like Boy Scouts when you're a kid or Girl Scouts when you're a kid, or sports teams. They are trying to foster this sense of community or togetherness. It's why a lot of parents prefer their kids to play a sport growing up. Doesn't matter if you're good or not, just to learn how to operate as a team, right? How to work together in a community. And this idea gets told to kids or, teenagers, but really, even as adults, we're being influenced by the people that are around us. This quote that comes to mind is, "You're the average of the top 5 people that you hang out with." And those people can be found anywhere, right? I mean, outside of your like immediate family, where do most people that you interact with, where do they come from? Or like, how do you interact with them?
I would say some of it for me is like longevity and history. I've lived in Tupelo almost 20 years now, and I live here because my very best friend from college was from here and lived here. And then 4 others of my college friends, they're just still like we live in some different places. Our lives and jobs are very different, but like we still get together. We try at least every month, every other month, and they're just still my core people. Like if I'm in a time of need, if something's going on, like that's who I'm reaching out to.
Yeah.
And so some of that is history that we have. And I mean, one of my friends already has a kid in college, and I have a 4-year-old. So we're living very different lives, but they are still like the core to who I am, and a lot of that is because of history.
Right. So they've known you through a lot of different life stages and through a lot of different
since we were 18.
experiences.
So a long time.
So you can call them at 2 a.m. when something's going terribly wrong, or just for a casual lunch date, whatever.
And like, I think we know each other's families, like extended families, and like, you don't have to explain things. Yep. Like you can just say, "Man, this is going on." They're like, "Oh, yeah, that again," or, know.
Right.
And so I don't know. I just find comfort in that history with those deep, deep friendships. And we don't see each other every day, but they're a vital part of my community.
What about you, Wes?
I think work is a big part of the community. I'm not from here. So, I've got kind of people all around, but it's crazy when you think about it. I'm 40 and I moved to Mississippi in 2011, and it's just been interesting to watch the shift in my life from, growing up in Ohio and living there until I was like 23, and then, going to seminary in Kentucky, and now being in Mississippi for, I guess, 14, 15 years. Ultimately, what I'm saying is that your community and what is home changes depending on who you are and where you are. I've worked for the Orchard for 10 years now. So people at the Orchard feel like family, because we've been around for so long and we know people and their kids, and the people know my kids. They're invested in me and my wife, and they are the people that I see the most often. So they're the people I would say I'm closest to right now, or I have the most relationship with. And then, outside of that, I don't really have any friends in Ohio anymore. I know very few people there, and that's okay. It's just kind of the way it is. So where you invest and where you spend your time is where your relationships are going to be. And especially outside of your normal sphere of influence and your normal rhythm, any relationships outside of that have to be intentional, because they're just going to go away if they're not, because we're so busy.
I've heard over the years different reasons why people will come join a church, or come try out a church. And one that I hear really often is that they want to get to know people. They want to get to know people in the community, or make some extra friendships or relationships in that kind of way. As you move to town, as you're kind of new in a place and you're trying to set up this idea of community. But what I've learned is that if you're just trying to do that on a Sunday morning, it's just not possible, right? I mean, the relationships you talk about are, friendships that you've had since college. Y'all have gone through so many different life experiences that, man, just if you were to span that out over just Sunday mornings, I mean, that's lifetime, right? And, you talk about being new to a place and new to an area. If you're just reaching out on a Sunday morning and just who you're sitting next to on a Sunday morning at church, that deep, meaningful idea of community is just not going to be there. Right, you've got to kind of bridge that a little more. Especially
in, we're fortunate in the Orchard family to have churches. We kind of have all the extremes. We have very small churches, and then we have a mega church as well. And I've worked in both the plant and the larger Orchard church, and I think it's easier to have more close knit community in a smaller church more naturally. Whereas if you go to the Orchard Tupelo, it's really easy to just kind of come and be anonymous and not be, known. And, we encourage people all the time, because I think the statistics are basically people will come, but if they're going to stay, it's because they've gotten in the community in some way. So we try to do everything we can to get people in a small group, but at some point, people might feel like, well, I don't know anybody here. Nobody's trying to, you've got to put some skin in the game, and some effort into I need, and it's no fun to put yourself out there, but I need to be in a group, or I need to be in community.
Yeah.
I think one of my favorite things I experienced, I ran our hospitality teams for a long time, and hospitality teams are kind of formed before service, after service, and coffee and donuts and things like that. And being in the kitchen with those teams, and it was always people who maybe they go to different services, or they may not, their lives ever cross over. But hearing those conversations, and some of our hospitality team members have been serving, for 20 years. And there is just that bond and that friendship of the craziness of a Sunday morning. And that's just a small section, but that's just another way too, that you can form a community in any of our churches, is to serve together. And I don't know, I've always just so enriched just to kind of be a bystander, but to listen to those conversations of how they shared life, even if it was just in 15 minutes, putting donuts out, and so that's just some of the beauty I think that our church provides to create those moments.
What I'm kind of chuckling about is that the intention is not that we would talk about community groups for the sake of hey, you should join a community group. But if you get 3 discipleship pastors together and talk about community, we're going to tell you ought to join a community group or a small group. That's why they exist.
Well, part of it too is because we've seen it. We've seen. I've been parts of small groups, and we see how our small groups love each other, and we see how they become family, and they reach out to each other. And then that's, like Jess was saying, that history, that's how you start. It's got to start somewhere.
Right.
History and relationships have to start somewhere. And, the reality is our culture is just getting lonelier and lonelier.
Yeah. More isolated.
Yeah. But and I don't know exactly where it comes from. I'm sure people who are more intelligent and philosophical than I am could say, but so at some point there's a belief that we're happiest when we kind of have full autonomy and just kind of can do whatever we want all the time.
Yeah, by ourselves.
Yeah, by ourselves. Like have our own little kingdom and grow that own little kingdom, but it's a lie.
Yeah.
We can't be happy that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think a thing that I like often repeat as a parent is that it takes a village, to like
Yes.
raise my kids. It takes even the people that I am close to and how our kids are all playing together, like that matters to me too. All of our friends. This idea that our community can call us to look more like Christ, or our community can call us to look more like the world. I know that there's a number of adults who maybe if they're not working, maybe they're retired or they don't work, that their lives become really insulated, really isolated, and they find a sense of community in a number of different areas that are not based upon Christ, that those relationships are not challenging them to look more like Christ. So, like if some of your closest friends from work, you don't really know their last name, but you know what they do every day because you're, cubicle mates or whatever, or you're season ticket holders next to this couple for the last 20 years and you only see them on game day. And, that might be the idea of community in your brain, but the way that a Christian community can call us at 2 a.m. and say, hey, this has happened, I need help. Or can call us and say, hey, I'm celebrating this. Do you want to come to this party? Do you know, like the idea that our greatest joys, our greatest sorrows can be shared is something that is really life-giving to us and something that Christ calls us to do.
Well, I even think too, because if truth be told, a lot of people's families are very dysfunctional, and then they really learn to their community that they make becomes the functional people in their life.
Right.
And that brings a lot of beauty to people's lives who maybe have not had the best experience with their immediate family.
Yeah, it can bring a lot of redemption to that story.
Yes. And so I think that's another great aspect of community.
Because it can be hard to trust somebody with that, right? I mean, with that like openness, the vulnerability that it requires to like implant yourself into that type of community. And if you've got wounds in that area, it can be really, really tough for a lot of people. Wes, you've been turning to a particular passage.
I just do that
scripture
to make it look like I'm studying or being studious while you're talking.
You don't have something to...
Yeah, no, I do. No, I just thinking in general, the call to love our neighbors as ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's a teaching, obviously an Old Testament teaching that is picked up by Jesus and kind of re-emphasized to love our neighbors and our enemies as much as we love ourselves. And I think like that's part of community as well. Is this sounds like really dorky, really nerdy, but there's like the whole Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it's like the whole idea is that for someone to be the fullness of who they are meant to be, that they like these basic needs have to be fulfilled. And when you look at like love your neighbor as yourself, and I think it could even be translated as love your neighbor as much as you love yourself.
Right.
And we think about like the things that people need, like safety, security, but then like affirmation and like encouragement and those, like we all need those kind of things, and we all desire those things,
right?
I think. And so it's so important, I think, for us to try to, for the stranger, for the person, another very emphasized call in the Bible to take care of the foreigner and the orphan and the widow. The three things that those people have in common is that they didn't have anybody. If you're a foreigner, you're completely brand new in a land that's not your own.
Right.
If you're a widow, you've lost your husband and your source of income in the ancient world. And then what was the other one?
Orphan.
Yeah, the orphan. You have no parents, and so these are the people that like their survival is dependent on other people looking out for them and taking care of them.
Yeah, on the greater community.
And that's always got to be part of community, is to be invitational. Like I'm the worst at this, like in real life at home. So like like people come to if somebody knocks on my door, or like I'm always like, who's there? Who is that?
Why would you knock on my door?
I'm offended that someone showed up to my house.
Just text me.
And it's like shows like in action. I'm kind of like, I'm not maybe the most hospitable person or neighbor at times in real life. And so it's whether that's your small group or like even your group of friends, we all kind of have like people we want to hang out with. And then, when you bring in the new person, it's work, you're like, I don't know them. I feel like my guard's up, like all these kind of things. But it is so important to provide that sense of community to people.
Right. And you bring up like the loving our neighbor. Y'all kind of scoffed when I said HOA, but I mean it. Like it's a ground of people. I mean, it's an amount of people who are all right there alongside you, literally, like as your neighbors. And I was asked to do something in HOA, to like be a part of something for HOA, and I wanted to like look the elderly lady in the face and be like, I will Ron Swanson this thing. I will dismantle it from the inside. I will do all that I can to slow it down, while also somehow loving you like Christ has called me to love you, because we're going to argue and bicker about, a speed bump going here or whatever. But, to love our neighbors, to live as Christ has called us to live, like even in our relationships, such as our neighborhoods, that it bleeds into every different area.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Jess.
Well, I was going to say, the story that we talked about with the friends lowering, I'm visual, and I'm like, that had to be like strength-wise, that could not have been easy. And so that always just makes me think too of like, you need people who are going to use their strength. They're going to jump in when you're in the most need. And it makes me think about our house got hit by a tornado in 2018 at about 11 o'clock at night. And like friends just started showing up, like in the pouring down rain, and we had about a 10-foot hole in our roof. Wow. And so like 4 of our friends got on our roof and put a big tarp like in the rain at 12 o'clock at night by that point. And it just really it meant so much that saved our ceilings. We still had to have a lot of work done, but like people just showed up and like they did the hard, like nitty gritty strength work. And you just want people who will use their strength to lower you down and be in it with you when you need it.
That's a great point.
I hope we all have friends like that, and hopefully, in community, we're hopefully creating those kinds of things. I think that's something that the Spirit of Christ does just naturally. So many of Paul's letters are kind of rebuking churches for allowing their selfishness and their own desires to get in the way of community. But I do believe where the Spirit of Christ is, there is unity. And in Ephesians 4, Paul says we're all called to be one church, one God. He uses the word or number 1 7 times. As like this completion. So God is like he naturally wants to form us together and bring us together, where our human nature is to kind of be selfish and rip community apart.
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of the product of the fall that would say that we are better off isolated, we are better off on our own. But even when we look at the life of Paul still had these really formative relationships that called him higher, that challenged him, that encouraged him. When we even think about like Paul's relationship to Timothy or Paul's relationship with Barnabas, as they're both sent out together, right? And I think that's Acts 13. Or as Paul writes to his younger brother in the faith in 1st and 2nd Timothy. I mean, that is their relationship kind of on full display and modeled for us of what it can and should look like for us to have somebody kind of behind us who we are challenging and mentoring, somebody alongside us who is encouraging us, even somebody beyond us who's been there before, who's lived that life. As you talk about your friend that has a child who's in college now. Though Evelyn's not even close to college, when she is going through these things and going through high school, that you can call up this friend and be like, can you give me some encouragement that it ever gets better?
I will survive the toddler ages.
Exactly.
Yes,
right?
I need to know that.
But it's because we have friends, we have these really formative relationships that are beyond us that can help us out even in the moment. And that's a part of finding community, is identifying individuals that you look at their life and you would say, I want my life to kind of look like theirs. I like the way that they lead at work, or I like the way that they interact with their spouse. That's really encouraging to me. Or, I'll enjoy hearing this person pray, and so I want to ask them about their faith and their spiritual journey as it pertains to their walk with Christ, and see what I can learn from that. Right? We identify things and we go, I just want to learn a little bit from you, and so. If we look at the lives of those who are around us, if we do become the average of the top 5 people that we hang out with, do we like that average? Like if you were to sit down and like write down the 5 people that you spend the most time with outside of like your nuclear family, the people in your household, you go, do I really want to become that person? Do I really want to become the average of these 5 people? Well, if this person's on their like 4th or 5th marriage, and this person's got a drinking problem, and this person's in major debt, and I'm just taking the average of all of these things, I go, maybe that's not the future that I want to hold for myself. So who are the people that I can be surrounded by that I would say, okay, I want to love my spouse like this person has, or I want to be a father or a mother like this person has been to these other people, or I want to learn the prayer life that this person has. Like we identify these characteristics and we go, that's the kind of person that I want to be and I want to be surrounded by.
Mm-hmm.
And to your point, Wes, from a couple minutes ago, that takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen accidentally.
I think that's why this is a discipline.
Yeah.
Community, this is why it's in spiritual practices and a discipline, because it's not something that's natural for our nature, and everything in our culture is telling us that we want to have as much freedom. There's a pastor and author named Mark Sayers, who I like a lot, of Australia, and he talks about how our culture kind of tells us like autonomy is what we really like desire, and that what we should have. Like we want to be free, we want to have freedom, and not. But the things that we do, if we really want meaning, the things that give us more meaning tend to be things that restrict us. So like, having, being married restricts you in ways that many people in our culture don't want to get married because of that. Yeah. Having kids restricts you in ways. And I can look in my life and go, yeah, like I can't do whatever I want all the time because I'm married and I have kids. But those are also the most meaningful things that I have in my life.
Yeah.
So in order to have meaning in our life, we have to make sacrifice. And in order to have community in our life, we have to sacrifice. And so I guess I'm just kind of like, from a pastoral perspective, like even if you don't like it, like kind of got to do it, like
it's still
what I
so
mean?
important.
Like, it's so important that it's a discipline, and if you have to discipline yourself to do it. And I can't tell you how many times I had small group and I would be like, oh, I don't feel like going to small group because I'm like, I'm tired or like whatever. And when I
want
went,
all these people in my house right now. I just want to hang out in my pajamas.
Yeah. And every time I went, it was great. Yeah. And I was glad that I did.
Totally
I never regretted. I was never like, oh, I should have stayed home.
Right.
Yeah. Well, as we close out, as we have done for the past however many weeks, just want to end with a couple book recommendations. Because again, for each of these disciplines, we can't talk about the full expanse of what these disciplines are and could be. But the first one we talked a little bit about is The Art of Neighboring. This was a sermon series for the Orchard, I don't know how many years ago.
It's been a minute.
But a while ago.
This 17 or 18?
Yeah, 18 feels right. That is still a really great book teaching us how to live on mission in our neighborhoods. So encourage you to pick that one up. And also Pursuing God's Will Together is one that comes to my mind. This was read by our church staff, but is still how do we intentionally take our communities and face them towards God's will? How do we pursue Jesus together? This is primarily talking about as a staff. So if you're a boss and have employees and want to go through that, I want to encourage that one as well. Thanks so much for tuning in. Thanks, guys, for being here. And whether you've been watching the whole time or listening or wherever you are, we are so glad that you have spent the last little bit with us. Hope to see you next week or talk to you next week. Have a great one.